You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Monday the 22nd of October. Yet another dignitary to add to Labour 25 list. Sikh councillor uses relative's blue badge to park his Mercedes. Mosque plans upset Gloucestershire residents. 3,000 doctors are putting patients on death lists. Spain and Italy are in depression, not recession. Generation Identity occupy mosque in Poitiers under Reconquest banner. British-based teacher leads armed jihadists in Syria. Thought for the day, memories of the good old days. And finally, they're homing pigeons, owner tells council. UK News. In the midst of the BBC Jimmy Savile paedophile cover-up, the BBC has been obliged to report on another Labour Party councillor and school governor for downloading child pornography. Councillor Brian Gate, who is a cabinet member for children, schools and families since May, has been arrested and charged with downloading sickening images of children being abused. He was school governor at St Dominic's Sixth Form College in Mount Park Avenue, Harrow, where he was also head of vulnerable children's welfare. One parent described the arrest as disgusting and went on to say that he is the 11th Labour Party councillor working in schools in Britain to be arrested for downloading child pornography. Police have seized Brian Gates's computer in the child protection raid on the Labour Party councillor's home, and Gates's wife Anne, who is also a Harrow on the Hill councillor, told reporters, "My husband is too ill to make a comment." This gives the Labour 25 list an impressive number of 40 personnel. An Asian Labour Party councillor and businessman, Sohan Singh, 58, has brazenly used a disabled relative's blue badge to park his Mercedes outside a council HQ in Glasgow. Singh was elected in May and was a city bailey, which means he would often be asked to stand in for the Lord Provost on official business. He was stripped of that honour when it was found out he had been operating as an illegal landlord during the months prior to his election. He is also owner of a hotel in Glasgow where his manager has had his assets frozen under criminal law and claims of hampering investigations by the police. If found guilty, Sohan could face a £1,000 fine for fraudulent use of a disabled blue badge. A World at 8 reporter comments, "Ooh, assets frozen. Now that does sound painful." Plans for a new mosque in Barton in Gloucestershire have angered people living nearby. A planning application has been submitted to convert the Ghuzia Islamic Centre in Charles Street into a mosque. Developers plan to demolish the toilet block and build a 2- and single-storey extension to increase the worship area. New toilet facilities will also be created as well as an extended space for women to worship. However, the plans have not been met favourably, with several people living nearby voicing their objections. Concerns include increased traffic, more noise, privacy invasion from the new build and smells from the toilet block. 3,000 doctors are putting patients on death lists that single them out to be allowed to die. Thousands of patients have already been placed on death registers, which single them out to be allowed to die in comfort rather than be given life-saving treatment in hospital, it emerged last night. Nearly 3,000 doctors have promised to draw up a list of patients they believe are likely to die within a year, Department of Health figures showed yesterday. As part of an unpublicised campaign endorsed by ministers, GPs have been encouraged to make lists, officially known as end-of-life care registers, of people they believe are going to die soon and should be helped to do so in comfort. Although more than 7,000 patients nationwide have already been put on the list, there appears to be no obligation for doctors to inform them. Some medical professionals went public with their worries yesterday following disclosure of the NHS request to doctors to put 1 in every 100 of their patients on death lists. European news. Spain and Greece are in depression, not recession. That impact was brought about by austerity. Nobel Prize-winning economist Jovis Stiglitz said on Wednesday, reports FAB, austerity is bringing Europe down and diminishes chances of making things work, he added, on the eve of an EU summit in Brussels. In Gainsbrücken, Switzerland, protests took place against absurd demands to tolerate excessive immigration. The protesters held lanterns on which they printed sad faces. The town's total population of 103 people are expected to host 80 third world immigrants. It seems that some genius Swiss authority wants these immigrants to run the local restaurant and pub. Details are a bit scarce as filming and interviews are all being denied, but more should come out of it as demand to know increases. A World Date reporter comments, "This madness must stop. If Europeans did this to an African village it would contravene the UN rules on genocide by population replacement." Poitiers, France. 100 young boys and girls from all over France have just entered the future Great Mosque of Poitiers and occupied it from the rooftops. On the facade facing the minaret they have unfolded a banner with the clear message "Immigration, Building Mosques, Referendum." With this first major action, Generation Identity intends to stand at the forefront of the struggle for their identity. It is almost 1300 years since Charles Martel stopped the Arabs at Poitiers after a heroic battle that saved France from the Muslim invasion. It was on the 25th of October 732. Today, in 2012, the choice is the same. Live free or die. Their message is simple. Our generation refuses to see our people and its identity taken away in indifference. Without the French there is no more France. It is a matter of survival. That is why all people have the absolute right to choose if they want to welcome strangers and to determine their proportion. We don't move back anymore. We reclaim a national consultation about immigration and building of mosques in France. We won't leave this place until we have been listened to and satisfied. Our fight has only just begun. We call on all young Europeans to become heirs of their fate and to join the advance guard of the youth who stand tall. May all Europe hear our call. Reconquest. World News. Abu Basir al-Tartuzi, an influential British-based preacher from London, has been discovered leading an armed gang of more than 100 Islamist fighters in Syria. In a video posted on the internet in the last few days, al-Tartuzi can be seen on a balcony surrounded by Kalashnikov-waving rebels after apparently capturing a hilltop village in a war-torn country. Security forces believe that dozens of British extremists, possibly as many as 50, have travelled to Syria to join the fighting, and some may have been recruited by Basir. This week a junior doctor of Bangladeshi origin from East London was charged with kidnapping 2 photographers in Syria, where he was said to be part of a 15-strong group of Britons. The security services are concerned that the brutal conflict in Syria could become a new Afghanistan, drawing in young men who return to Britain radicalised and keen to continue a fight to spread Islam. A World Date writer comments, "Oh no, not more of the buggers." Police have arrested a controversial Tanzanian Muslim cleric for stoking religious hatred. Sheikh Ponda Issa Ponda's arrest comes after Muslim protesters vandalised and torched 5 churches in the main city, Dar es Salaam, last week. The violence followed rumours that a Christian boy urinated on a Koran. More than 120 people had earlier been arrested over the attacks, one of the worst cases of religious conflict in mainland Tanzania. Thought for the day. Memories of the good old days? Well, the good old days. You might say yup for some, but were they so very good or very bad? I'm only going back to the days which I remember, so do not bother to count my age. I'm practically crone-like, really. I'm viewing them from my background, which was middle class. But the 50s are where I will start, because growing up for me started then, past the age of dribbling, which I of course will be soon approaching on the great circle of life. Now if you look at 50s films you'll note several things, and although films are not a good way to look at life then, they are more truthful than the crap we get pushed at us now. You will note when looking at films of London or the South the absence of people, except a few walking along the streets. Even in London there are massive spaces without the general mass of hooded and obviously ethnic people. Bliss. Women, unless they were really professional women, and I mean doctors, nurses and solicitors and the like, stayed home and actually were there when children returned home, usually walking or off the bus from schools. Fathers, most of them were hopefully working, maybe not in the ecstatic office environments of today with all its PC culture and work-friendly surroundings, but nevertheless working, and came home too, depending on your social status, tea, supper or dinner. Teenagers didn't exist, neither did their spending capacity for mobiles, trainers, clothes, drugs and drinks and sheer rudeness in public. My generation were classed as young adults and expected to behave as adults, not the reverse. The only people drunk in public were men who had problems, and they hailed mainly from the north, bless them. The southern equivalent stayed in the pubs and then drove home. Thankfully the sight of drunken girls pissing in the streets was not the norm in the UK. Men were not frightened of making a pass or whistling, and girls went out of their way to flirt. In short, much more normal than today's behaviour, where youngsters seem to pay more attention to their mobiles, PCs or their own sex than the opposite sex. We had pubs in which you could smoke, drinking clubs, restaurants which were mainly Italian or steakhouses, dancing clubs, meeting halls, youth clubs, coffee bars and later in the early 60s, wimpy bars to meet guys. Adults had parties at which not everybody passed out. People belonged to groups and political parties without harassment. Socialising occurred on every level and a lot of it. Older people were looked after and sought after for their counsel. We did not have health and safety in sight, thank God. If you fell down and bled and had the honour of a large plaster for days. You didn't do certain things because it would either get you into trouble with a teacher or your parents. The odd slap from a teacher did no harm. You were never called a racist because you noticed someone was a different culture from you. You could eat your meat and know it was English, killed in England by an Englishman. Your parents did not drink or take drugs in your sight, if at all. Adult time was adult time and children time was just that, for the children. Showy, large, expensive weddings were not the norm. Girls had children, not careers. Men married women, not men. Homosexuality was practised but behind closed doors, not on the streets. The same for prostitution. Sex education in schools did not exist, it was up to your parents or life. Certain alternate lifestyles were not introduced to babies in preschool then. Drugs were not available to very young people. Drink was a rite of passage for boys, not girls. Men asked girls for a date, not vice versa. You would not find yourself on YouTube or a mobile phone if you did something you'd rather not have done. People formed memories from those days and did not live their lives through looking at people on TV living theirs, or rather not. As for our poor young white men, I pity them. I'm talking about the bright young lads who in the 50s would have done an apprenticeship or for carpentry or plumbing at a technical college, or made their way through grammar school up to the civil service or the police. The 50s, although blindingly awful for poor guys down the mines, served our youth better than now. In the 50s our schools held only, for the most part, white pupils. You had large public schools from old organisations, like the Haberdashers' Asks, which offered scholarships for the talented poor. You had the old public school system, which was considerably cheaper than it is today, and which also ran scholarships. You had private schools which ranged from fairly affordable to expensive. You had grammar schools for both boys and girls who'd passed their 11 plus. You had village schools, suburban schools and large town free schools which were classed as council or state schools. In short, after the war, schools came into their own, and the range outclasses that of today's rat holes in the state system. True, there are some fairly good comprehensives, but in the words of most parents, you have to be living in a good intake area. In the 50s, the main battle was to find the money, if needed, for education, and many parents made more sacrifices in those days to get their kids educated than now, and I know this because my mother did it for me. In the 50s, the only children seen in state schools were those poor little souls whose parents simply could not afford any money to pay for them. You certainly did not get yummy mummies driving large cars and going back to large houses with their progeny from the then council schools, tapping the state system and a plethora of immigrants occupying 90% of the classes. It simply did not happen. In the 50s, houses were not decorated to within an inch of their lives, neither were gardens. Money was not spent on Chinese crap because we made most things we needed in the UK in the 50s. We did not eat or buy massive amounts of junk food. In the early 50s we still had rationing, so sweets were off limits, and I can still remember when my convent school opened a tuck shop in the demise of rationing, and the joy of spending an old threepenny bit every day still lives with me. I seem to remember my favourite was a Trebor curly stick of hard candy with a chocolate inside, and sherbet dips. Oh, bliss. It may sound as if I'm doing what I promised myself I would never do, that is, laud the good old days and go back to my childhood, but it does seem that the social engineering of our culture, country and people has had a more profound effect in the last 50 years than that of the 50 years previous. The changes wrought have been so very different and have had such an effect on us as a people that even I feel forced to comment on it. People were different. They were more polite. People aspired to being better, not worse. Women were happier, as were children for the most part. One will never do away with bad parents, bad governments, bad housing, the poor, no jobs and not much money, but we seemed to have a standard in life in those days that we do not have now. Even our small immigrant population, which was then mainly confined to West Indians, Hindus and Chinese, wanted to take on the British way of life, not bring their own with them. Although the West Indians did get attacked in the East End, it was not surprising. The East End and the Docklands had barely recovered from the war and times were bloody tough in those areas. I still remember living outside London, but when a new Chinese restaurant opened it was a cause for joy, not resignation that yet another British pub had met its fate. I miss the 50s because the children who sold the poppies for Remembrance Day did not need chaperones against Asian lads spitting on them in Bradford. I miss the 50s because our skyline did not consist of minarets and calling towers. I miss the 50s because queues in London did not consist mainly of foreigners buying things to resell. I miss the 50s for many, many reasons. The main reason being that England was a pleasant place to live then. We were English and proud of it. We had not been opened up to the EU. We owned our own farms and our fishing rights were our own. Our country was our own. The wrongs in our country were our own wrongs, not the fault of outsiders and corporations. The world was smaller and we were not a country reduced to being a haven for criminals, illegals, cheats and the unwanted riffraff of the world masquerading as immigrants or religious colonisers. Our politicians, whilst not perfect then, did at least consist of men from all parties who held their beliefs close to their hearts. Our unions were not multiracial and greedy havens of destruction, but operated for men and women who needed help. Our youth was not a lost generation of mismatched and misinformed morons. Once a country loses standards, it's a long hard fight to get them back. I hope we do so, for our own sake. And finally, Pigeon fancier Roy Day was sent a letter by Gravesham Borough Council last week telling him that his neighbours had complained about the noise and smell from the 20 pigeons he keeps in his garden shed. They were also a health problem and that he had 7 days to get rid. Mr Day, father of 8 from Northfleet, Kent, and who is a member of the National Pigeon Racing Association, told them it said no matter what he did the pigeons would come home because that is what they are trained to do. He also said his sons would be devastated if the birds went. Apparently you're allowed to keep 12 pigeons in a purpose-built loft. A council spokesman told the Gravesend Messenger newspaper this week Tenant Roy Day did not obtain permission to keep pigeons at his council property. There have been many complaints from residents about noise and mess caused by the birds. The council has now asked Mr Day to rehome the birds since he is in breach of his tenancy. A World-to-Date reporter has commented, "What a fuss. I've seen a picture of the birds' home and it's clean and well away from neighbours. I would rather have pigeons than noisy dogs or even noisier children." The sad fact is that whilst Mr Day occupies council territory, the council have the last word. And councils would rather house immigrants with all that entails than our own people with a few birds. Someone needs to take these birds in locally and give Mr Day a chance to still see and race them. If I lived in Kent, I'd do it. I love pigeons. You have been listening to The World at 8. I am Lynn Mozart and I wish you all a very good night.